Welcome back. So today we are going to take a look at CCA's latest hybrid, which is the Hydro. And before we touch anything, I do want to give you a little bit of a size comparison. So this is Hydro. I call this one the KZL. This is the KZ large format shell. This is ZS10 Pro 2, which I would call the KZM. It's the medium size shell. It's one that you are familiar with if you bought a KZ. Years ago, they were using that style shell. This is the more recent modern version of KZ shell, and I'll call this one the smaller one. That is the Polaris, so the one that tends to show up on some of their more recent one single dynamic drivers. So, as I said, this one's a little bit bigger. You can kind of see what it looks like kind of next to these guys. It's a little bit bigger, not hugely bigger, but definitely a sizable shell if you are used to smaller IEMs. And on the back side and on the nozzles, you can kind of see it's got the smaller style nozzle, but this one has the more extended one. This one is kind of the medium, and this one is the smaller, or pretty close. They're going to be all pretty close, and then that's what they look like there. So yeah, pretty much people who tend to look at their larger shells and think they're going to be a problem for their ears. You guys have smaller ears. You do want to think twice about a IEM shell that's this big. But if we look at the back, you can kind of see there's the 8mm there, 7mm there. There are 8 balanced armatures, which are kind of split into 2 4 packages, which you can kind of see there's a 4-pack there, and there is a 4-pack on that side as well. So that's Hydro, a little up close and personal. The other thing that is a little bit different with Hydro is you do have the option of purchasing the silver blue cable. So this is the high strand count. They call it high core counts, about 784 cores split across, or I would call it 784 strands split across 8 cores. So a really nice, high quality, dense cable. I've actually purchased this one years and years ago. It's an older KZ cable that they decided to offer with Hydro. And again, if you have other KZ sets, it's actually worth having this one. Just be aware that it is a little bit thicker, a little bit denser. It actually is. It actually feels like it's more dense than your typical KZ cable, their normal 2-strand one, which I think they call their standard silver plated cable, which is the option of that one. And then the newer one is the 784 core silver and blue, which is what we just saw. So that is that. So let's kind of start with, I think when I look at what people making buying decisions and people who buy sets and then like them and don't like them, I think one of the things that people tend to misjudge or don't have a real gut feeling for are the bass levels and the bass shells, and which styles of bass shells is more applicable to the music they listen to. And I talked about this with Dusk, and I talked about this with Cadenza. These tend to be very sub-bass focused. They have almost no, or that's pretty much a 0 mid-bass boost style sound. They want to have some bass out here and then have a very, very clean all the way through the mids. And then your focus is going to be right up there in the upper mids and those female vocals. That's where those two sets very much applicable to those style genres, people who are really into female vocals. That's where those style sets really tend to work out well, and why they're shaped the way they are. So variations try to really split the difference, and that is this one in the orange. So not quite as tucked or as lean as Cadenza and Dusk. Give people still more sub bass, more impact and boom kind of out here, a little bit more impact here, but still drop it pretty close down. That's about 250. So a little bit more bass, a little bit more sub bass, a little bit more mid bass, but then still have your clean mids, but dropping it just a little bit later. That will impart just a slight bit of warmth into your mids, and that will make those sound a little bit nicer. That's kind of why Variations is a nice set. Some people will listen to it and say it's too light on mid bass. Some people will really appreciate that it carried over just a little bit, and then you have a really nice upper mid for female vocals as well. And then you get to top, which has a lot more mid bass. This is kind of a full mid bass style with a full sub bass style, and this is your warmer, smoother style bass shelves. Those of you who like male vocals, who are looking for some energy carried into your mids to make them warmer, you get a really nice, warm, smooth carry over right into the mids, and then kind of a relaxed treble. And that sort of started with Blonde BL03. That is that style sound. Top is just a very, very nice version executed on a hybrid with very nice drivers. So it's a super version of this warm style signature. And again, very, very appealing. It's just not so focused on female vocals. This carries over, from the sub bass and drums and impact all the way through into nice full-bodied vocals and instruments that have a nice richness to them. That's why people like that dusk sound. So when we look at Hydro, I would call this sort of the best of both worlds. So I don't call this rolled off sub bass. I call that clean sub bass extension. So you can kind of see the end level is pretty much where dusk and cadenza end. So you still have plenty of sub bass extension. It's just not booming, and it's not interfering with your mids like other sets that do single dynamic drivers that really aren't all that capable tend to try to hit this level and just sound a lot boomier. So I love the long arc where you tilt this down because there's not a ton of sub bass in most popular music. You just need to have the depth to it. You don't need the boom to it. Unless you're listening to hip hop, then the boom is great. But for most genres, you're just looking for the depth to drums as opposed to the boom for drums or the bloating that you get from a higher version of sub bass level. Then you get into mid bass, and then this is a kind of a full mid bass style again. Boosted mid bass, male vocals, depth, body, dimension, all the things that lots of genres need. That isn't, so again, not so focused here, but this is a very full bass style, that richness and just a little bit of warmth that gets carried in through the mids. I tend to look at about 300 hertz and see what level this is. Is that 1, 2, 3 dB? And that's kind of the warmth level that you get carried into the mid. So again, and we'll talk about this in a bit. So clean sub bass extension, mid bass impact that makes drums have that tangible, tactile quality to them. Male vocals that need the body to it, that's what you get there as well. But also remember that this is done on an 8mm and a 7mm dynamic driver, so it's actually going to arc over a little bit lower than what it appears here. These smaller diameter dynamic drivers tend to graph really high, but in your ear, their impact and presence isn't nearly as much as they are if you were thinking that's a 10mm. So it's definitely closer to splitting the difference as opposed to being the outlier bass head version of a bass shelf. So there's some general things on bass shelves and why people tend to buy the wrong one. So let's kind of jump into it, and I'll say that kind of right off the bat, I do love Hydro a lot. It's actually a very, very nice set. It is the one that is not like the others, despite borrowing some parts from Rhapsody. So I think the balanced armatures were actually borrowed from Rhapsody, but now there's 8 of them, and there's 2 dynamic drivers, which I believe are both different than Rhapsody, but the 8mm or the 7mm is the XUN driver, and the 8mm is something else. But either way, I think you can kind of look at it and say, is it just a fancier version of Rhapsody? And I think no, it actually sounds quite a bit different style tuning, definitely a better implementation, and all around, I would say it's a huge improvement over Rhapsody, despite having some parts from Rhapsody. And I would say, and mostly that comes from this statement. This is probably the first KZ CCA set that noticeably scales with Source. If you're used to KZ's prior hybrids, and I'll put Rhapsody sort of in a little bit of this same category, those that had less separation, less resolution, less bass definition, Hydro will sound like a set from a different brand. That was a pretty typical KZ style because of how they were implementing their driver packages, how they tied the balanced armatures together, how they tubed those or ported them. They had various versions from their balanced armature sets from their old, even when you look at the KZ ZS10, how they were piping those drivers all the way through into the nozzle is actually different than the way they do it today. And Rhapsody and I think a couple other sets were doing this dual port. So you have a bigger port for the bass, and then you have a smaller port for the balanced armatures. That is something they started a little while ago. And finally on Hydro, they've kind of got all of this actually working together. And I think KZ found the design recipe that really allows for end-to-end transparency. And I would say transparency is what was missing on the prior hybrids. The upper end was sort of okay. You kind of got the feeling that there were balanced armatures there. But no matter whether it was 5 balanced armatures or 8 or like 12 on an AS24, they never quite hit the resolution and resolving that you were expecting it to be for such a high BA count. So Hydro is definitely going to be the first one that is 8 balanced armatures that clearly sounds like 8 balanced armatures. So as I said, the switches and the graphs, don't pay too much attention to that graph because, as I said, it's a 7mm and an 8mm working together on the bass shelf. It's really hard to wrap your mind around what it's actually going to sound like if you're used to seeing 10mm. The switches, I would say, again, the bass shelf looks big. It's big. It's not for 8mm and 7mm. But unlike other sets on the switches, I think the switches are useful to run through by ear. I wouldn't necessarily look at them. That's why I didn't show them on the graph. You definitely have to switch them and run through it with your music on your sources. I use them mainly to match my sources. So on my SMSL, I was using 111 and 0. On my IFI Zen 3, which is the new one that came out, I was using 1010 just because it's a little bit warmer and I didn't need that little extra bass boost. It's a very fine tuning switch on these, or tuning change on these. It's very subtle, and you hear a lot of it in the warmth of how much warmth is it adding to that bass curve. And again, it's a 7mm and 8mm. It's a little bit different than what you're expecting, but I would absolutely say flip through all the switches and the settings and get a feel for what each one is doing on your particular source, how those match to your particular music styles, and do pair those to the switch settings. So is there an advantage to having so many drivers? And I think KZ, that is a very valid question for KZ, because KZ was one of the participants in, high BA count sets back in the day. They kept on increasing drivers, and people would wonder, well, you've added a new driver this year. Does it really sound different than last year? And I think that kind of got to the point where they were just adding more drivers, and KZ wasn't alone in this. And there wasn't really that much of a change to resolution or ability to resolve or extension. It was just simply adding drivers to say that we had the most. And so I think it is very much a valid question. And again, I will say that Hydro is probably the first one where they really got that right. And we'll start with the 2 dynamic drivers. I'm absolutely sold on the 2 dynamic driver concept. I was a little slow to adopt. I didn't really like the 0. The con was kind of okay. I think some of the initial dual dynamic driver sets were kind of okay. But when you get into Dusk and Hype 2 and Hydro, this implementation of how they're doing dual dynamic drivers, it actually is quite an improvement over single dynamic drivers. It definitely took some time to refine it, but I do think they're here to stay. Why? Because these sets with dual dynamic drivers can do both controlled sub-bass extension. You have that snappy mid-bass impact, which is what most single dynamic drivers are missing, and you can pair this with faster drivers. And that's sort of where I talked about Dusk and Hype 2, and I'll talk about it with Hydro as well. It's the pairing on hybrids. It's always been a problem to pair faster balanced armatures with slower dynamic drivers. You always notice the difference between the two, and unless you were like a cadenza, you were using a very high quality single dynamic driver, you always notice the difference between. There's always a mismatch there. So when you listen to Dusk, and why I called out Dusk and it had such a great bass level and bass implementation, Hype 2 was the same thing. Very impactful, very snappy, still had sub-bass extension. It did a very, very clean, nice bass shelf. Hydro is kind of right there with those two as far as a very, very nice implementation of something that KZ kind of danced around with their single dynamic drivers, but there's no KZ single dynamic driver that hits both sub bass and mid bass this tight, this extended, and this clean. They just don't exist. So I do think this dual dynamic driver, whether it's KZ's implementation, someone else's implementation, I'm kind of a big fan of the dual dynamic drivers now. And 8 balanced armatures, that tends to move you into $200 to $300 territory. And I think lots of 1+1s all the way up through 1+5s. You're definitely hoping for natural, but you're never going to win the tech beast. And this is exactly where Cadenza 4 that was the the thing on that set. Very, very natural set, but technically wasn't all that superior to anything else. It sort of hit the wall at 1+3. 1+4s, 1+5s, you kind of hit the same wall. When you get above that level into the 1+8s, you start to hear the classic BA text, those sharp attacks, the speed, the resolution, the resolved detail, the wide dynamics, decays, reverb, extending resolution all the way through upper treble. This is also known as very high resolving sets, and that's exactly where the tops are and the variations are, and that's sort of where Hydro is going to fit as well. Hydro is easily the first KZ high BA set that sounds like it, and again, it hits all these points to the point where you're not just hearing a dual dynamic driver, that is being complemented by the 8 balanced armatures, and they actually do sound like 8 balanced armatures. Very, very nice implementation. The first time that KZ has really pulled this off, where the 8 sounds like 8, the 8 doesn't sound like a 1 or a 2. It goes back to that exact point of where in the past, and I know all of you were thinking that in the past I've heard high BA sets from KZ and they never really sounded like it. Again, Hydro is the first one where it actually sounds like it. So sound, UV warm, depending on the switches. Like I said, the first 2 switches are going to give you a little bit of warmth, takes a little bit of the warmth away. But the 2 dynamic driver plus the switches really makes it a playlist killer. This was pretty much a 0 skip set for me. I don't talk anything about music in here. There was no music where I would say this set sounds better on certain styles of music, or I skipped this style of music because it didn't fit. This one plays them all because you have some switches which will give you a little bit more mid bass or a little bit more sub bass, and just putting that in, taking it away for more critical styles, that works absolutely perfectly on this set. And then you get 8 balanced armatures which are giving you the detail and the ability to resolve and everything else that you need for lots of genres. So yeah, this is probably the first set where they've gotten it all pretty much right and dead on. So bass, again, this is my favorite shape. The long arc is a no compromise, clean bass, enough mid bass to do male vocals, but dip the sub bass so it extends with no bloat. And that's typically where lots of $100 sets, even $200 sets, definitely sub $100 sets, they tend to not get that part right. They don't dip it enough, or at least dip it enough for the driver that they use so it actually sounds clean. They just throw it out there and hope that no one notices. It's a nicely resolving set, and the smallest bit of bloat or boom was really going to stick out against the 8 balanced armatures. I definitely take more bass on Rhapsody, but with Hydro, it's definitely more about the clean, sharp hits, so there's always extension with black backgrounds on this guy. Again, that's why I love the long arc, because it creates a really nice black background. You still have sub bass extension, but above that, really clean background, which we'll talk about with the mids. No other KZ set controls sub bass and mid bass better to allow the bass to extend but still have that tactile impact. Again, that is a huge benefit of using 2 dynamic drivers. It just seems to be clearly easier than finding the one perfect single dynamic driver that can do both, which is more of a unicorn thing as opposed to a common thing. Definitely with 2 dynamic drivers, a lot more sets are hitting both the sub bass and the mid bass in a proper ratio, and giving you the ability to have a very full sub bass through mid bass style bass shelf. And again, I think all of that with 2 dynamic drivers is all here to stay, simply for that reason. Definitely not bass head levels like it shows on the graph, as I said. So the mids. And again, I think on prior KZ sets, there was some combination of drivers and tuning and tubes, how they were porting the balanced armatures all the way through into the nozzle. It was never quite right. It was always great for the price, and I think Rhapsody fits that as well. But Hydro is really the first one where it starts to hit both tonally and technically. And again, I would say I'll start with the black background. I've talked a lot about black backgrounds. No one talks about black backgrounds. But it makes a huge difference when you have really nice source gear to hear a black background, because everything in front of it is sharper, more contrast. It just pops. It's no different than a high definition TV or OLED that has a pure black background. You have apparently more dynamic contrast, and it's more vivid. exactly the same thing that happens with audio when you have that black background. There's nothing clouding the background. You're not losing any air because there is some bad sub bass there. That's exactly what happens on Hydro. Super crisp, very clean. APAs show through, very, very nice. Better than any other KZ sets, simply because they have a better bass shelf that is cleaner and tighter and two dynamic drivers and everything that I just talked about. So, yeah. You get that contrast for the mids to pop. You could hear those parts of tracks that you haven't noticed because everything is super clean now. There's no fuzz in the background, which was hiding some small details. Then those lower mids, just enough warmth and presence to have body and dimension to decay. Like I said, KZ tends to blow the decay because they make things a little bit brighter. The upper mids take on that balanced armature, sharp definition, ability to resolve and have those fast dynamics to take it to higher ranges. There's really no other set that is front to back, layered, and separated like Hydro. They just, again, it kind of goes back to how they were combining different drivers together. They never really had the separation and the layering that warranted the BA count that they were using. This is probably the first one. Again, this one eats resolving sources, so plug it into something nice, and I wouldn't even go warm because that's going to miss some of the good stuff. Flip the switches if you want the mids, if the mids are dropping back a little bit. If you have too much bass, the mids will step back a little bit. And on the treble, so the treble is sort of where KZ has struggled in the past. I think KZ's balanced armatures have a KZ sound to them. It's not Knowles, it's definitely not Sonian, but they have a KZ sound to them. If you are a tamper head and really into how balanced armatures tilt the naturalness of sound, then you're probably going to get annoyed at another set of KZ balanced armatures. For the rest of us, I think KZ has come far on reducing that BA timbre. It's still there, so there's still going to be a slight bit of nasalness to it. It's still going to be recognizable as a balanced armature. The treble isn't going to have that refinement of a Sonian, but they did a really nice job at making it resolving, and I think that was the right move here, right? If you can't beat them on one factor of naturalness or sounding refined, make sure you had other bits, the two dynamic driver, the 8 balanced armatures, the black background. They did a really good job of putting together the whole package, even though this one bit still sounds or kind of resembles BAs of the past. They are clearly getting better, but to be honest, this is one of their best extensions to level ratio. Typically KZ, especially recently, has been really bumping up treble levels. Symphony was kind of off the chart. I think Caster kind of annoyed some people, and Trio started to walk it down a little bit. Again, Hydro walked it down a little bit. I think they are kind of zoning in on levels of treble that kind of work generally for more people. And when you find the switches and the tips and the source, the treble should be smoothly extended from lower all the way through upper without any peaks. The warmth will make it a little bit more forgiving than most KZ sets. And again, like I was just saying, that Caster, I think that was one of the problems on Caster. It had a harshness to it. Hydro definitely smoothed that out with a little bit more warmth, a little bit less treble. It kind of smoothed out the forgiveness factor on the treble on that one as well. And Stage, I don't really have any complaints. It's actually a very, very nicely staged, not staged the same way as other KZ sets. It's more reflective of the source, and a better source with a more immersive stage. This one gets more immersive, but yeah, out of the box, it has a very, very nice stage. Like I said, layered back to front. Everything is nicely imaged. It's actually a very, very nice stage, but I just tended to notice that it was shifting a little bit depending on the source, and he put on a very nicer source that has a deeper stage, and then suddenly this has a deeper stage. So very, very nice. So that was a lot of words on Hydro, and again, I do like this one very much. I think it's probably the best KZ set that has ever come out. I think it tops AS24. It certainly tops Rhapsody and some other sets. And I'm not sure they're actually going to beat this one for a while. This is, they're calling it the flagship, and I'm not sure, at least in 2024, they would try to top this one. It's actually very, very good. It's probably the first one that really does compete with more expensive sets in this $200 to $300 set range. And there are lots of bad $200 to $300 sets, so not a lot surprised that I would say that this one beats lots and lots of $200 sets because there's lots of bad ones. But yeah, this is pretty easily the first KZ set that that takes a swing at sets in that range, and we'll have no problem beating quite a few of them. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.